Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Caballero Anthony. And I would say that your sentiment regarding the preliminary or the keynote address of Professor Kim are very much shared, because when I was listening to them, I thought, oh wow, this is the literature, and actually, thankfully, the conclusions of my paper, or the basis of my paper, very much fall in line with the idea that for sustainable peace to take place, there are certain requirements, and these requirements have met severe challenges in Cambodia, in the case of Cambodia. So I'm very pleased to present challenges to Cambodia's sustainable peace and tasks for peace research going forward. The thesis of the paper is fairly straightforward. It's the idea that the poverty and the socioeconomic disparities that originally fueled the 1970s era of civil war and the Khmer Rouge genocide have endured to the present day of Cambodia, and underpinning the country's unconsolidated peace. So the paper looks at the unconsolidated peace, the unconsolidated democracy that have prevailed in Cambodia since the UN departed in 1993. And this has been caused, in my view, or this has been fueled by the weaponization of the law, or essentially the idea that justice and the rule of law have been masquerading, in fact, and that behind this is the rule of man. And we know, of course, that the same prime minister has been in power for 37 years, and that has encouraged a lack of accountability and impunity, in fact. And I conclude with some of the challenges to sustainable peace in Cambodian tasks ahead for peace research, though I must say this was the most undeveloped portion of the paper. So I apologize to the external reviewer for this, because it really seems like I got to that, and it was probably the last piece that I couldn't quite finish. So the argument of unconsolidated peace. Well, although the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror and genocide has ceased, the current Cambodian government remains politically and civically dominating, segregating the social classes in terms of income and social disparities. Cambodia's security, human rights, and peace are unconsolidated. And I'll just take you a little bit back to the time of the Paris Peace Accords of October 23rd, which were really the crowning achievements of the international community in terms of bringing peace to Cambodia. After all, it was the end of the Cold War. It was just around the time of Fukuyama's end of history, this idea that somehow we had reached this Hegelian synthesis where there would be only democratic peace at the end, so that the marketplace and democracy would combine to create essentially an outcome that was predictable. So the Paris Peace Accords of 1991, I would argue, did lead to an absence of violence, which we've heard Professor Kim talk about as, in the literature at least, as being totally inadequate for what is really understood to be peace. So the absence of violence is not really peace, right? I mean, it's just people stop fighting. But this idea, of course, is actually rather old. In 1957, Martin Luther King said, I come not to bring this old peace, which is merely the absence of tension. I come to bring a positive peace, which is the presence of justice and the kingdom of God. Peace is not merely the absence of something, but it's the presence of something. And it's the presence of justice and equal opportunity to share in the rewards as well as the opportunities of a truly great society. Of course, he was speaking of the United States during a period of civil rights. But I would also argue that both justice and equal opportunity at this point are sorely lacking in Cambodia. And we know this from essentially what has happened in the interceding years, right? In the period since the UN tried to bring peace and an election to Cambodia, that was probably the closest thing to a free and fair election. And after that, things essentially deteriorated. So here, an image from that time. UN helped protect Cambodian people, stopped killing Cambodian children, and so on. Now, the other element of of this is the democratic element of it. So democracy, I would argue, is unconsolidated. And why is that? Democracy is unconsolidated. It's not on life support, as the narrative of the ruling party is very much one of, we brought peace to Cambodia, you should be grateful to us. Yet it's really victor's justice. The total elimination of the main opposition party a few years ago has really led to an absence of accountability, an ability for the people to choose an alternative to the current regime. So in fact, this opposition party received nearly half the votes, but now it's not on the ballot anymore. It's the Cambodian National Rescue Party. And speaking at the groundbreaking ceremony in January 2022, Hun Sen said, some analysts had spoken in news articles that for a country to be truly at peace, there must be peace of mind as well as a lack of armed conflict. He argued that peace was not about social injustices or political or elimination of political discrimination, but about people not getting killed or injured in war, as in the past. That the same idea of an absence of violence. Quote, so you still do not have peace, he said. You elevate all demands to be reasons for determining whether there is peace or not peace. I stated my definition here, a country that used to be torn apart, turned into a country without war. Only that is what I can guarantee. He further stated that a vote for his party is a vote for peace. And these banners started appearing saying, thank you, peace, around the country. But of course, this is a message that is about really the dominance of a ruling party and the ability to suppress opposition. Of course, there's peace in the sense of an absence of violence, but in fact, it is not truly positive peace. It's negative peace. Of course, thankfully, he's not arguing anything about Asian values in terms of, saying that somehow Cambodia is being an Asian country does not need to have democracy. The kind of argument that Lee Kuan Yew made in terms of culture is destiny, and that was, of course, received a response from Kim Dae-jung, a rejoinder in which he said that there was this myth of Asia's anti-democratic values. We know, of course, that democracy is not something that is unique to the West or should only be enjoyed by the West. And so I think it's quite appropriate to say that even in the Cambodian context, the authorities who don't practice democracy still want the mantle of democracy. They still want to appear as though they've brought peace and democracy. And while Cambodia still pretends to be a democracy, it is ruled in the last 37 years by one man, by an individual who has not been able to see power, although he's now named a successive prime minister, his own son, in a kind of dynastic move. And of course, that has led, I think, to the view that he's got to go because he's an obstacle to peace, that he brings about a lack of peace as a result. Japan, please stand with the Cambodian people. This is a recurring refrain. Every year, Japan has been asked by the Cambodian authorities to speak at the UN on the issue of the UN Human Rights Office, which has been placed in Cambodia since the Paris Peace Accords and the UN mission, because of Cambodia's historic legacy and in having suffered genocide. But this office, of course, is a thorn in the side of the Cambodian authorities. And so the Cambodian authorities have asked, and Japan has obliged in saying, this UN Human Rights Office needs to go, it shouldn't be there. But thankfully, there are counterweights to that, which have resulted in that UN Human Rights Office remaining in Cambodia, although far less influential or less capable of being outspoken than it used to be, in my view, because the special envoy is constantly assailed by the authorities in Cambodia. The idea that democracy matters, of course, we heard democracy is respect for the people's will, and that has been, of course, ignored. And we understand that, of course, we can have situations in which there can be elections, but these elections are meaningless because this is an election without democracy. And how is that happening, or how is that even possible? Well, it's through the use of the law, and that's what the paper argues, the weaponization of the law. And while the aim of development partners such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank is to establish the rule of law in Cambodia, and the language of the authorities frequently invokes the rule of law as a basis for why an arrest must be carried out, it is in fact the rule of man that prevails at the political level. Nothing is ever done without consulting with the ruling party in terms of a judicial decision that is political in nature. The law has been weaponized to allow, I argue in the paper, for the prioritization of power over human rights, democracy, and sustainable peace. And Hun Sen and the royal government of Cambodia have been operating under a smokescreen of democracy. So it's a fascinating, as I argue, because democracy seems to be something that the authorities relish in terms of arguing that they have, but they're not actually interested, of course, in actually, putting themselves at risk in terms of an electoral defeat. So they would like the legitimacy of an election, of being seen as having been elected, but they do not want an actual a chance to lose, because if that were the case, they wouldn't have argued for the elimination of the opposition party, the dissolution of the opposition party. So they do this in order to justifiably eliminate opposing political organizations and reduce the liberalism that remains in Cambodia. And the Supreme Court is used to do this process, to dissolve the country's main opposition, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, back in 2017. What's interesting is that having done this and having won essentially through this process all the seats in the last national election, that hasn't been enough still, because the authorities are now cracking down on even the faintest kind of opposition. So a friend of mine, Terry Sang, who is a Cambodian American lawyer, has essentially been faced and now is in prison for treason and incitement. And so in her attempt to shine a light on the lack of freedom and the lack of respect for human rights, she before she was arrested went around in this Statue of Liberty costume, and then of course ended up imprisoned nonetheless. That is really, I think, an indication of how far the authorities have been willing to go, and it is fascinating and obviously heartbreaking, because here you have a Cambodian American who, in her case, lost her parents during the genocide, who's willing to risk it all in Cambodia, having dedicated years of her life there to fight for human rights and democracy and peace. And the answer is, she has committed treason and she needs to go to prison. And they've moved her actually from a jail that was close to Phnom Penh, or in proximity of Phnom Penh, to one that is on the Laotian border, so far away that it's become very difficult to actually figure out what's happening with her, because there isn't really a presence out there to constantly monitor her well-being. The lack, of course, of justice in Cambodia, the inequities have spread to issues of land rights, land grabbing, and the idea of, frankly, that without land, there can be no home and there can be no life, and that's true whether it's microcredit that has been used to kind of sell people on the idea of easy money, that then turns into, well, you couldn't pay your loan, so now we have to take your land away, which of course causes even more poverty. Lack of justice, which has also made people unable to find jobs, have made people unable to live as a result, and to have families, all of course blamed on the kinds of partners that the Cambodian authorities have enjoyed in recent years, which involve Chinese companies like Union Development Group, which has been active in Cambodia in building sites that appear to also be military, possibly dual-use facilities for the Chinese government. So this is obviously tied into a kind of partnership that Cambodia has made with China to emulate China to use Chinese methods in suppressing its own citizens. A disheartening development, to say the least, when a country, of course, was aided by the West in having the largest at the time UN peacekeeping mission ever in 1992, 1993, to have an election that was held. Of course, the outcome of that election was very strange because one side won, but it became no winners, no losers, and two prime ministers at the end of that election, which was strange because obviously one side did win, but they just couldn't take power, and that was, of course, not the current prime minister of Cambodia. The types of human rights abuses have extended to, as I mentioned, the land grabbing and the unwillingness to hear any kind of to brook any kind of dissent. So here you have Yuan Bapa and Tep Vanny, and for centuries in Cambodian schools, boys and girls have sung a poem in harmony. A virtuous woman is gentle. She speaks softly and sweetly. She walks without making a sound and smiles without showing her teeth. But both these young women will have none of this. Both women were not even 30 when they picked up megaphones, broke through police barricades, stood up to water cannons, and campaigned against corrupt politicians. Mostly they spoke in defense of hundreds of poor families like theirs who had been forcibly evicted from their homes to make way for a luxury complex in the heart of the capital. They were convicted of intentional violence and led away by police in December 2012. Yuan Bapa yelled, "Who does the judge work for? Does the judge work for the people or not?" Thousands of people have either been evicted from their homes or at risk of losing them since the Chinese development company was granted a 99-year lease in the lake that these women used to live around in 2007. In the following year, the developer began draining the lake to make way for construction. A promise of consultation with local residents was never honored. So really quite, it's these moments in time have also created really heroines in the story who have paid a terrible price, right? They've been jailed, they've been traumatized, and they've been injured as a result and unable to really continue their work in their full capacity. But they continue to be active. They continue to talk about how important it is to find justice. And that's how peace, I think, will be achieved when that justice becomes truer to the reality of what is happening in Cambodia. And of course, the authorities have been reinterpreting the Cambodian Constitution, my paper argues, because the Cambodian government on its path to hegemonic authoritarianism has been doing this in terms of the Constitution in order to constrict the freedoms of its people. The criminal code and the ruling articles have been amended to limit fundamental rights of Cambodians. In 2018, the criminal code was amended to include punishment for lèse-majesté offenses, something we, of course, know of in Thailand all too well. But in Cambodia, this is a relatively newer phenomenon. And really the use of lèse-majesté is uncommon in a place like Cambodia. But now, of course, it's being deployed. I think there's a lot of observation that takes place in terms of countries looking at other countries and learning their tricks of the trade, and along with lawsuits bankrupting opposition folks, suing them for millions and so on.
Dr. Earl, another 2 minutes,
yes.
please. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, 2 minutes, yes. I'm literally at the final slides here, just pointing out that the Constitution has been amended in terms of articles where political parties here shall primarily uphold the national interest and shall not conduct any activities which either directly or indirectly affect the interests of the Kingdom of Cambodia and of Khmer citizens. Every Khmer citizen shall primarily uphold the national interest and shall not conduct any activities which either directly or indirectly affect the interests of the Kingdom of Cambodia and of Khmer citizens. And the Kingdom of Cambodia absolutely opposes any interference from abroad conducted through any forms into its own internal affairs. These can be interpreted very broadly. The national interest, whatever we say, the ruling party says, is decided upon by the authorities. And so that national interest becomes interpreted reinterpreted, and then people go to jail as a result because they're deemed to be opposing the national interest. So I'll end with just a few thoughts on sustainable peace in Cambodia. What are the challenges and what tasks remain for peace research? As I've mentioned, China is an enabler and an accomplice almost to Cambodia's lack of consolidated peace. Of course, equal opportunity is missing. Democracy is practiced in Cambodia is performative. Justice and the rule of law are used to suppress opposition. Fear prevails, thus freedom from fear has not been achieved. And in terms of future peace research that still needs to be looked at, we have to continue to find solutions for unconsolidated peace in Cambodia. Unequal opportunity, lack of democracy, injustice, the rule of man are all reasons for why there isn't peace to this day. Cambodia is now invested in this global peacekeeping industrial complex. What lessons can we learn from this? And what lessons might Cambodia itself learn from its activities in peacekeeping? Could there ever be norm penetration from Cambodia's involvement in global peacekeeping? So I'll end it there. I'm sorry about the background noise. I think there's a party going on without me out there behind, outside my bedroom, but I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.